undertaking, but it's difficult.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I'm going to skip over a few of the operational challenges, then we can go back to them if we have time to talk. I think one thing to think about, and this is something I think for the interagency committee, the interagency labor committee that I imagine will be administering this process, as well as to the demand side folks, so workers' rights organizations, unions, labor stakeholders, and the like. It's going to be incredibly important that the first cases that come up under this are strategically selected and impactful. There's a scenario in which there could be, thousands, and think of how many covered facilities exist in Mexico, thousands of complaints brought, and I think on the U.S. government side, I think there's going to need to be a process developed with very clear criteria for selecting which cases are the ones about which a request for review is made, and on the demand side, a very strategic selection of which cases to bring so that they are the cases that will have a good demonstration effect. I mean, I'm thinking just off the top of my head, criteria, a large employer, high profile employer, a fact pattern that is not incredibly complicated as many in freedom of association cases are. Try to find something that is pretty clear cut if possible, something that has name recognition in terms of who the facility is supplying so that it becomes even higher profile, so that it has a greater demonstration effect. I think this is something that isn't going to need to be figured out both on the U.S. government side as well as on the demand side. I want to talk really
I'm going to give you the chance when we have questions.
Okay. About limitations, because there are a few limitations and the sectors that are covered as well, because they're not all sectors.
And I don't mean to cut people off. This is terribly interesting, but we want to make sure we give everyone at least a good opportunity to speak. And now we're going to kind of shift away from the details operationally and what's going to happen to more of an opinion about what this is, what it means, how it's impacted. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks, Ken and Wita, for inviting me to be here today. Thanks to all of you for coming out this morning, and it's wonderful to be on this excellent panel with some old friends. So I did want to talk a little bit about the historical and political context of the labor provisions in the USMCA. What does it mean, and where will we likely go from here with respect to labor and trade provisions? And as Nicole so kindly pointed out, I've been doing this work for over 25 years, and so all my gray hair came from the trade negotiations in the past. And I want to just make one disclaimer at the outset, which is I'm not a spokesperson for the labor movement or for the AFL-CIO. I don't work there anymore, and I wasn't party to the the negotiations or the inner circle. So I'm seeing the same kinds of outside information that you all have. But I think when you look at the 25 years of starting with the first NAFTA, the first time that we put labor provisions into a trade deal, as we all know, very weak in the side agreement, not enforceable with respect to freedom of association, only really committing Mexico to enforcing its own labor laws. We have, over the last 25 years, sort of progressively strengthened and worked on and used those provisions. We, the labor movement and other workers' rights organizations, used the NAFTA labor side agreement to understand what worked and what didn't work, where the weaknesses were, where the loopholes were. And I think that process has happened throughout, as Carol said, the Cambodia multi-fiber arrangement agreement, which was actually a real pioneer in terms of trying to empower workers at the workplace level, where the workers could actually go to the Ministry of Commerce and say, my factory isn't allowing us to unionize, you should take the export license away from that factory. It really did work. It was galvanizing because it put an economic incentive on an individual factory worker. And I think since that time, through the unilateral preference programs like the Generalized system of preferences, where we have had the ability to bring cases and put pressure on countries, we have struggled with all these issues about a private right of action versus state-to-state action, about how granular, like, if you take trade preferences away from an entire country, is that too much of a deterrent? You might actually not want to use the labor provisions because there certainly were arguments made with respect to Bangladesh, for example, even when there were pretty egregious violations of labor rights under the Generalized system of preferences. There were plenty of people in both Republican and Democratic administrations said this is too draconian, we can't afford to take away trade preferences from a whole country. So there was a desire to be able to use more surgical tools. So I think that the USMCA provisions are an interesting and important outgrowth of where we had been in the past. And I guess I would make one other political observation, which is that looking at the progression, Cambodia, Jordan, and then I think what I would call some backsliding during the George W. Bush years, the CAFTA and Australia, Singapore, Chile provisions that were weaker than we'd had in the past. And then there was a big move forward. And you all remember, I think, because you're all trade nerds, the May 10th deal that was made. Remember that that was made during a Republican administration, and under pressure from Democrats in Congress, the Democratic leadership in Congress, Sandy Levin and Charlie Rangel, with the participation of the labor movement, moved forward a big leap forward for the May 10th deal. And this, the USMCA, is also a big leap forward that comes again under a Republican administration, a Republican USTR. And I think it's really interesting, just when we think about the politics of trade, that some of the sort of the partisan lessons are a little bit topsy-turvy. That Bob Lighthizer, USTR Bob Lighthizer, made concessions that Mike Froman thought were unachievable, or he wasn't willing to make those concessions, whether it was with respect to investor-state dispute settlement and pharmaceutical companies, or taking the labor provisions to a new level. And I think that's, I'm going to come back to that point, but I think that's something I want you all to think a little bit about, because for me, the lesson of USMCA, the most important lesson, is that reform is doable, it's achievable. We can make progress beyond what we have had in the past, and of course we need to, because I think one of the reasons that there was so much effort put into the labor provisions of USMCA, and that the labor movement and Senator Sherrod Brown worked so hard to innovate the enforcement mechanism, is that there was widespread recognition that what we had in place was not adequate. It was not working. That there were loopholes in the language, and that there were enforcement inadequacies that were crippling. And one of the examples that's often given, and that I would use, is the Guatemala case under CAFTA, where the AFL-CIO and other groups brought a case that took 9 years to wend its way through the system and was ultimately dismissed, even though I would say to you that was a very strong case. There were, I think, 5 or 6 union leaders who were assassinated. The government took no action to bring those folks to justice. And I was told by the USTR's general counsel, when I was in my capacity at the AFL-CIO, that murder was not, in fact, a violation of the labor provisions of CAFTA. It was a rule of law problem, not a violation, and that didn't constitute a failure to effectively enforce the law in Guatemala. The fact that 6 people could be murdered for trying to exercise their legal rights. So I would say that was a weakness in the enforcement mechanism and in the interpretation of what have we agreed to, that there were key definitions that needed to be clarified. So the USMCA was a really good faith attempt, a lot of effort from the labor movement to close loopholes, create new enforcement mechanisms and tools, and I think it's very likely that those provisions will have a positive impact on Mexican workers. We need to wait and see, but of course the current Mexican government is pretty pro-labor, pretty progressive, and I think has shown a willingness to do that. And so I think that is something we need to keep an eye on, we need to work on, we need to make sure that we are working closely with Mexican unions and workers to see what's going on. But I want to talk about the rapid response mechanism and what that represents in terms of an innovation. So the idea is to create a pathway, as both Ted and Carol have said, create a pathway for individual workers or unions to file complaints that can get addressed pretty quickly. And it's not a complete private right of action. Of course, it wouldn't be workable if every individual worker who had a problem with labor law enforcement or wage theft or anything else could go straight to a dispute settlement mechanism you would tie up. That would be a very cumbersome process, but I think it does address one of the key issues. One of the key problems with enforcing the labor chapters in past trade deals is that governments often are not willing to expend the political capital and to annoy the government in question, even when there is an egregious violation of labor rights on paper, like obviously, like the law is actually in contradiction to what the stated rights are. And so that reluctance to not use up political capital, and I've seen this repeatedly over the course of my long career, where governments just look me in the face and say, you're not wrong that workers' labor rights are being violated in country X. But this would upset the delicate balance of our relationship with country X, and we're working with them on anti-terrorism, or they have a new government in place, we don't want to irritate them, or XYZ reasons. Both Democrats and Republicans have not gone forward. So in that sense, I think the idea of the rapid response mechanism is clearly designed to help move forward. And if it brings attention to more of those cases, I think that is a good thing.
1 minute.
1 minute? Okay, I'm gonna speed up, talk faster. And so the USMCA addresses two of the problems. One was the unwillingness of governments to use the mechanisms that they negotiate, and the other is the surgical application of sanctions, the ability to really address what's happening at the factory level, and I think that's great. There are a couple of other areas in which there's progress forward. A difference is in the labor chapter of USMCA. It addresses problems with migrant workers and makes very clear that they should be subject to the laws, whether they are documented or undocumented. It shifts the burden of proof on how we adjudicate a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. It addresses violence, so it adds at least a paragraph saying that violence isn't good. So that's, I think, progress forward. And as Carol said, Annex 23A is a little bit unusual because it is a very detailed listing of commitments that the Mexican government will make, and I think that can be useful. And it's also true that I think it's important that investor-state dispute settlement, some of the pharmaceutical provisions were addressed in the last-minute negotiations, and yet the environmental provisions were inadequate from the point of view of a lot. And so there's still a split in labor in terms of whether this is adequate or not adequate. The AFL-CIOs, steelworkers, Teamsters, strongly in support. They were very closely involved in negotiations. Other unions, like the machinists, have expressed more doubts as to whether this will really address the outsourcing. And I think in terms of the macroeconomic impact, it is not likely to have a huge impact on American workers because we already have the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. We already have zero tariffs. This is changing the conditions around the edge, and yet it is important. It is something we can build on, something that we need to use in order to see what are the obstacles, what are the implementation challenges. But I think it clearly represents progress. Thank you.
Thanks. And I was just going to say, now let's turn it over to Ricardo and get sort of a perspective of the target of what all of these provisions seem to be, rightly or wrongly. But share with us your perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation again. Let me give you, I suppose, to give you the Mexican perspective to all. But as everything, I think you have to, first I will give you the perspective from the standpoint of the labor chapter as it is, but maybe give you a more, from a trade notion, what does this chapter means going forward? And as the title of the conference tells you, whether this is a new paradigm in trade agreements as to labor provision. And the way you can look at this is, as always, pessimistic or optimistic, glass full, glass empty. Let me give you the two views. If you look at it from the pessimistic standpoint, the glass empty point, I will agree with Carol, the implementation of the labor chapter in Mexican, under Mexican law will be a very, I would say, more than daunting task. Because you're going through a new labor reform, you're going through new labor provisions, and the way you insert the mechanism into that system will be very problematic in some instances, but it can be doable. At the end, there is a compromise by the current government to endorse these provisions and really look into enforcement. So the signal is good, but if you look at it at a point, it will be very, very daunting to implement this. Many will say on this side that the standard is just too difficult to comply with. The standard put up in the new USMCA. And companies will say that the exposure is too big. At the end, this has to do, because as Ted was saying, it's not just a failure of a system of labor laws. A company will have to be, or will have to take into account whether they are complying with Mexican labor laws. So if you look at it from that point, I think it will be a lot of challenges in doing that. And there will be companies that would certainly be worried about the whole system. But there's another way to look at that. You can look at it from the standpoint of glass food. And I always wonder whether the government never used this argument, the Mexican government never used this argument to pass to make a good argument about why this chapter was good for Mexico, which is Mexican workers in the United States. Because this chapter goes both ways. So we have around 50, I may be wrong on the number, consulates in the United States, all over the United States, east, west, north, and south. And you don't need inspectors in the Mexican case. You just need to go to a Mexican consulate and hear what the immigrants come to go to the consulate officer and tell them about not being paid the minimum wage, about not being paid by dollars or being paid by the weight or by something. So at the end, you don't, at least from the Mexican side, or the way I see it, is you don't need inspectors. You have consulates where workers go directly and put their case into it. So if you look at this as an opportunity, I think the Mexican government should look at this as an opportunity to enforce or to see that the U.S. labor laws are enforced on our immigrants. And I think and I'm surprised that the Mexican government never gave this spin. And instead of that, the Mexican government used a red herring, in my view, which is this issue of this notion of inspectors. Because for us that are trade geeks, we know that we have inspectors all over trade. We have inspectors for rules of origin. We have inspectors in anti-dumping matters that will go over all our accounting of a firm. And now that the Super Bowl is closed, I don't know if nobody tells you, nobody knows, everybody knows that we have APHIS officers in Michoacan looking for the avocados, looking to see that Mexico complies with their standard on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And this is big, you're talking about people, if you have a plague or something, you could die. So I don't know why this whole fuss about inspectors, because we do it every day in the trade context, in rules of origin, dumping, or sanitary. But so that's the first part. And the second part, and I don't want to be put up by the chair, but let me give you some thoughts because about the big picture. And talking about the name of the conference. How do we came to this, to where we are now? We started with some, as it was said correctly, some kind of hortatory provisions on labor, or cooperation provisions. It's nice, it's good. Then we came to the NAFTA. What was the NAFTA? The NAFTA, at the end, what NAFTA said was, okay, you have to comply with your labor law, and we will address only systemic failures. When your labor law is cracking, we will intervene and you will be allowed to impose trade sanctions on the labor side, but only for systemic, for really when your labor system was cracking. What did we do now? We came a step further. And we really went to a system where it will be easier to initiate a labor case than a dumping case. And for us that know a little bit how difficult to initiate a dumping case. You know how difficult it is to initiate. So that is true. You can even target a company, a facility. In dumping, you cannot do that. And look from the public perception standpoint. When you look at a CEO of a company that has dumped, you will tell them, oh, you dumper, you bad dumper, you shouldn't be dumping. But what if you look at a CEO that has been accused of using child labor? Wouldn't that change the public perception of that company? So, and that has to do, or to go to extreme cases in labor court. So, that begs the question, at least in my mind, and that's maybe I'm the only one worried about, is whether we have really jumped and really convert what was a trade agreement and the notion of a trade agreement, and we even wash it more down when we include this presumption on a manner of effective trade. So you don't need to show that you are, the only thing you need to show is that the goods or services has been traded. You don't need to show, if a shoe company in Mexico violates labor law and that shoe company never exported to the U.S., that company could be liable, despite not even exporting one shoe to the United States. And that applies both ways. So the question, again, reflection, is whether we really went overboard, for the good reasons maybe, on including this, and we undermine a little bit the notion of a trade agreement by including this kind of provision. And I would leave like reflection on that, and I comply with it.